right? And I mean, everything is based off of that. I mean, imagine having all of our faculties completely shut down and not having those things. I mean, you couldn't function. We don't function without our five senses and our ability to think about the very things that we draw in from those five senses, right? Well, we don't really draw anything much from, well, we draw in from taste and touch and hearing and seeing and smelling and all that kind of stuff. They help inform us about the world. So, a person, if one is honest about life and how they get through life, and people, matter of fact, I'm going to tell you that everyone does this, just not everyone does it either consciously or with good training. And so this is why this information is so important. But we evaluate things all the time in our life and we make decisions about them. And I know this seems this seems okay, yeah, that's true. But there's ways in which we can have a clear worldview, okay? A worldview that measures up with reality, and that's important. I'm not so concerned as much as what worldview you have. Well, I am, but I'm more concerned about why you hold the worldview that you do, and I think each person should be asking themselves that question. Why do I hold the belief system that I hold? Why do I think this is true? And how can I know this thing is true? See, one of the tests for one of the ways in which we try to figure out whether what we believe is true is what we call logical consistency. It means that that within our beliefs, none of them contradict one with another. Does that make sense? So,
give an example.
Yeah. Let's say, well, I'll put up one. Here's example. There's two different kinds really. There's like explicit contradictions. Explicit means it's easy to see. It's very open. It's on the surface. There's what's called implicit contradictions. That means that I have one belief, and that belief kind of implies something. There's something kind of there underneath. And I have another belief, and underneath that kind of implies something, and those two implications rub up against one another. They got a problem. They clash.
Darwinism and creationism?
That might be something, yeah, that might be something like that, exactly. Matter of fact, I'm going to give something a little more explicit than that. So, one might be, explicit contradiction would be, God exists, and God doesn't exist. That's real easy, right? One is the negation of the other. One says yes, and the other says no. If I held both of those at the same time, my brain would be kind of going weird. I'd be contradicting myself. Now, a contradiction, I'm sorry?
You'd be a humanist?
Yeah. Now, a contradiction, though, a contradiction happens when you have two things that don't agree, so to speak, in their meaning, but also it has to be at the same time. There was a time when I had the belief that God didn't exist, and then later I had a belief that He did. And so those two beliefs don't necessarily contradict each other in one's worldview unless they exist at the same time. Does that make sense? Right? So you can hold one view at one time, you can hold another belief at another time, and so long as you're not holding them at the same time in the same way, then they're not in contradiction. But if you hold them both at the same time in the same way, then they are contradictions. So that's one. An implicit one is like what you said. If I said that naturalism are true, is it true? Or atheism is true. That's one belief. That's one thing. And then I said that Jesus Christ is the second member of the Trinity. Those two things contradict because atheism means there is no God, and the second one means that there is a God, right? So once you kind of drop down and really figure out, well, what are these two things really trying to get at, you realize, bam, they contradict. There's a problem, right? So not only that, but our, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later, but the categories, I'm going to go into these categories a little bit later, but the categories of our worldview, the way we think about things, the way we come to know, the way we view reality, those things can't contradict. If they do, they cause us some turmoil in our life. They cause us some problems. It's more difficult to figure out what we should do. And I'll get into that a little bit later, but just kind of keep that in mind when I go through these categories, and I'll kind of try to sum that up a little bit later on, but I'll show that to you. So logical consistency is one. Another one is how well our worldview explains reality to the extent that we know it. And in a community, we can have a much larger extent, right? So let's say I don't know much about engineering, but I know more about some other topic like Western philosophy or something like that, right? So if as I learn more about what you understand about engineering, you learn more about what I understand about, let's say, Western philosophy, if within those two worlds, worldviews, we realize, within those belief systems, we realize that something contradicts, something's going to have to be given up somewhere. We're going to work as a community to try to figure out which is not true, which is true, right? Otherwise, there's some kind of tension. Now, maybe we won't work together. Maybe I'm just like, nah, I'm going to hold mine. You say, no, you're going to hold yours. But in the world today, that's what happens, right? We have scientists who are discovering these one things, and then we have people who study ethics and that kind of stuff. They're informing us about another thing, and then we have political scientists, and they're telling us this is the best way to have a government. We have all these different views about things, right? Social issues, all these kind of things, and yet some of them obviously are in tension, right? That's why we have these elections. We have the one guy saying, no, this is the way it should be done. Somebody else saying, no, this is the way it should be done. These tensions, these arguments that are happening are coming from worldviews. They're coming from someone who thinks this is how reality is, and this is the best way for us to live within what's real versus what's not real. There was a time back in the ancient Greece time where they thought there were hundreds of gods, and they lived accordingly because that's how they thought that it was. So they had to deal with this god concerning the rain, they had to deal with this god concerning the sun, they had to deal with this god concerning if you're going to have children, and they conducted themselves in life, and how they dealt with one another. And then there was a conflict between Persia and Sparta. Right? I don't know how many of you've seen the movie 300, right? But there was this conflict, right? And the Spartans believed something about their way of life and their existence, and the Persians believed something else, which was we should own the world, and the Persians were spreading out and all this kind of stuff. Well, that's a worldview. Persians felt, hey, this is where we belong. This is a worldview. We've got the right way of life. It's our gods that are real and should help us rule the world. And the Spartans like, oh no, that's not the way it's going to happen. This is called scope. You think about it, when you have a telescope or a microscope, right? It gives you a view, right? And the more your idea of what reality is, okay, the more it can explain or understand all of what we know to be reality, the better it does. It's called explanatory scope. And by the way, I've got a handout for later on, so you don't have to write everything down if you don't want to. Just feel free to write it out.
I'm good at not writing down everything.
Yeah. I didn't want people to get distracted by the outline and all this stuff and not that kind of stuff. So explanatory scope is one. In other words, the more areas that we encounter in our life, see, that are with the way we view things, the more it can explain, the better it is. If a worldview can't deal with a particular area of life, and it can't answer the question, we would question, well, what is wrong with that? Now, I think it would be a little too